On behalf of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, I would like to welcome you to the Department of Political Science, a department to which we are very grateful for lending this beautiful facility and room so that we could host this most important event here today. I'm also delighted to welcome in our ranks Professor Norma Joseph, my friend and colleague and founding co-director of the Azrieli Institute. When Norma and I dreamt of the Institute and the program, an undergraduate minor program in Israel Studies, we both wanted to create new courses for the program. And Norma created a course in the study of women in Israel, women and religion in the state of Israel, and I decided to introduce a course on Israeli government. There had been many courses, of course, taught at Concordia about the conflict, about Arab-Israeli relations, and so forth, but surprisingly, no one ever thought of teaching a course about how Israeli politics are actually organized, what are its sociological, institutional, historical, cultural foundations, what are the processes by which the conflict gets articulated. And I signed up to do that, to design that course. And that was all nice and dandy until I actually had to identify a book or some kind of a collection of texts that would help the students master this unmasterable body of material. And then I remember that beautiful summer afternoon when Hel and I, and Diane, and our spouses, my wife Andrea, we met in Jerusalem for a beautiful vegetarian dinner in a restaurant called Village Green, which is no more, at least not at the location where it was. And Hal told me, Chava, I'm in Israel researching for a textbook that we are about to write with Brent Sasley, a former student from McGill. And I said, I've heard that before from colleagues. I mean, there are plans and there are plans, there are contracts and there are contracts. But when I heard that the book is out and is just hot off the press in time for the adoption for my course, I couldn't have been more delighted. And so the result of that interaction, the result of that planning is now here in my hand, and certainly the textbook Politics in Israel, Governing a Complex Society, published by Oxford University Press, is now being adopted by more and more departments and courses on Israeli government in the United States, in Canada, and I understand also in Israel. We now have the first adoption for the course. And of course, the pair of authors, Professor Waller and Professor Sasley, are so well known to us here in Montreal. Both of them, and of course, Professor Waller has ongoing connection to the city. Professor Sasley still has fond memories of the city, and of course, earned a PhD from one of our esteemed institutions. So it made eminent sense that at a time in the context of a semester when this book is actually being used in our undergraduate classroom, we would invite our colleagues, Professors Waller and Sasley, to tell us about the book, why they wrote it, how they wrote it, and why they wrote it in the particular way that they did. Before I would say a few words about the two scholars to you, before I would introduce to them, I do want to share with you a couple of very important statements, if you will, that you will find on the back of the book. And it's really important because while you may or may not believe me that the book is helpful and useful, because I ended up adopting it for the course, let me read out to you what two very important senior scholars of Israeli politics actually have to say about this. One of them is Steven Spiegel from the University of California, Los Angeles. And this is what he has to say. Politics in Israel is the best book ever written in English on the history, politics, and government of Israel. It is comprehensive and balanced, comprehensible and interesting, inclusive and wide-ranging, informative and sweeping in its coverage. The writing is excellent, and the tools that the authors provide are invariably useful. And the same sentiment is echoed by Professor Alan Doughty, who was a visiting scholar at the Institute just a couple of years ago, who is now a professor emeritus from the University of Notre Dame. And this is what he says. The book is clearly written and logically organized. Politics in Israel offers a judicious portrait of the Israeli political system. It is highly recommended for all courses on the subject. And certainly my experience with the students so far also reinforces these sentiments and these arguments. And now, let me tell you a few words about our two speakers, and then I will tell you about the plan of campaign for the rest of the evening. So I'm going to start with Professor Waller. Professor Harold Waller is a professor of political science and chair of North American Studies at McGill University, where he has served as chair of the Department of Political Science and associate dean and acting dean of the Faculty of Arts. He was also president of the McGill Association of University Teachers. He holds also degrees from MIT, from Northwestern and Georgetown universities. Professor Waller was co-author with the late Daniel Elazar, an important publication, Maintaining Consensus, the Canadian Jewish Polity in the Post-War World. And this book received the National Jewish Book Award in the United States in 1991. Professor Waller taught many courses and published numerous scholarly articles on Israeli politics and foreign policy. For over 25 years, he actually taught the one and only course in North America on Israeli domestic politics. Professor Waller was one of the original members of the Workshop on Jewish Political Studies and the Jewish Political Tradition in Jerusalem, and continues to serve on the editorial board of the Journal of Jewish Political Studies. He's a fellow both at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and the Canadian Institute of Jewish Research. As part of his work with the Canadian Center for Jewish Research, he has appeared frequently in public forums on Israeli and Middle Eastern issues in Montreal as well as in Toronto. In 2012, he was decorated and received the Jerusalem Prize by the Canadian Zionist Federation. Professor Brent Sasley, in 2007, earned his PhD in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. He wrote a dissertation on individuals and the significance of affect, foreign policy variation in the Middle East. Currently, he's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Texas at Arlington. His research and teaching focuses on Israeli politics, Middle Eastern politics, in the international relations and foreign policy decision making. His most recent book, which is co-authored with Professor Waller, is of course on Israeli government. I do want to mention that Professor Sasley has been also co-authoring a growing number of publications with another McGill graduate, Professor Mira Sucharov, who is currently holding a tenured position at Carleton University, another product of Professor Waller's many decades of pedagogy and dedication to teaching and scholarship. So, after this brief introduction, the agreement is that we would ask each of our two speakers to speak for no more than 20 minutes. That would allow us to start a Q&A at around 6:30, which we will have to keep a very close and tight lid on, because at 7 o'clock we do have to leave the room. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the same order as I introduced our speakers, I give you Dr. Waller, and then I give you Dr. Brent Sasley. Please join me in a round of applause to welcome.
Thank you very much, Chava, for a very generous introduction, and of course for organizing this event, which is very meaningful to both of us, I would say. We appreciate the hospitality of the Azrieli Institute and the efforts of staff, Jennifer, Solomon, in putting together this evening. I'm going to try to address two kinds of issues tonight. One is a little bit about why and how we wrote the book, what led to it, and then some comments on some of our findings. So what were our goals and objectives in writing the book? As Chava mentioned, I've been teaching a course on Israeli politics for many years. And interestingly, this started in an era before BDS was the prevailing value system on campus, because students came to our department and said, we want to have a course on Israeli politics. And although I did not have training in Israeli politics as a grad student, and I had no experience teaching the course, I had been involved in various activities in Israel over the years, and so I felt that I was ready to attempt to learn what I had to teach the course. So for many years, I used books that were available, but for the most part, the courses that involve Israel that are taught in North American universities generally focus on the Arab-Israel conflict, Israel and Palestinians, what we in political science refer to as international relations. My personal interest professionally is not on international politics, but rather on what I call domestic politics, the internal politics of the country. So I teach courses on American politics and so forth. So over the years, although I found books that we could use, I wasn't entirely satisfied with them. They didn't have all the material that I felt needed to be in a book like this. And I also thought that they had excess material that detracted from some of the main points that I wanted to make in my teaching. So I felt that there was a vacuum, and in discussing things with Brent, I found that he had similar impressions. He's been teaching Israeli politics out there in Texas for a number of years too, and we concluded that there were few, if any, books that were geared to the kinds of courses that we teach, and thus we came to the conclusion maybe we should write our own book. So although we wrote it for our own courses, obviously we hope and really believe that this book will fill a very useful place in courses that are taught elsewhere about Israel, and could be used also in courses on comparative politics, for example. We've just heard about a colleague in Israel who is using the book in a course comparing Middle Eastern countries and so forth. But we think that it has more significance beyond simply being a textbook for students. I honestly believe that anybody who wants to understand Israel needs to go well beyond the usual discourse on the Arab-Israel conflict or Israel and the Palestinians. And if you follow the news coming out of the Middle East, almost all of it deals with that, except when there's an Israeli election. There's much more to Israel than elections and disputes with the Palestinians. So I believe that any layperson who wants to be well informed about Israel, wants to really understand Israel and how politics operates, how decisions are made in the Israeli government, can gain a lot from a book like this. As far as the Arab-Israeli conflict, generally we try to avoid it in the book. We do have a chapter on Israel and the Palestinians, but mainly for the purpose of illustrating broader points that we make in the rest of the book. So what we really are trying to achieve is to enable readers to comprehend Israel on its own, and not simply as a major actor in the conflict in the Middle East. Interestingly, we have a range of students with different backgrounds. Over the years that I've been teaching the course, I found that my students fall into three categories: Jewish, non-Jewish and non-Arab, and Arabs. The last group either from North America or from the Middle East. Jewish students tend to come into the course feeling, well, this is going to be easy because I've been learning about Israel ever since I was young, and I guess my job here is to disabuse them of that notion, which I try to do in the first month before the change of course period is over. Then we have, Canadian students, American students who need a course to fulfill the requirements for political science, and this fits into their timetable, and they've heard a little bit about Israel. Okay, so I'll take the course. So they come in knowing very little about Israel, except what they've read in the newspapers, and as you know, the generation of students today seems to be allergic to newspapers. That's a vestigial avocation for people of a certain generation. But in any event, they don't know much, and the question is how interested and motivated they are. Obviously, the job of the instructor is to try to get them excited and motivated. As far as Arab students go, there are two kinds. One is the student who comes in with a definite animosity toward Israel and great hostility. At one time, I can report that Yasser Arafat's nephew was registered for a course, and I assumed that he was probably in that category, but he dropped it before the end of the ad-drop period, so I don't even know what he looks like. But there are other Arab students who genuinely want to learn about Israel. And I've found over the years some of my best students, most successful students, have been Arabs who come in with an open mind. They learn about Israel, and maybe they're even motivated to go and visit Israel. And I must admit that one such student got so motivated that not only did she go to Israel to work for an NGO, but while there she fell in love with an Israeli soldier. So there are all kinds. One thing I made clear to the students, and I think it's reflected in the book, is that I don't teach a course in which we're going to discuss the question whether Israel should have been created or not created. There are 193 states in the UN, a dozen more that are not in the UN. Israel is one of the states. And just as we might study Chinese politics or French politics or Brazilian politics, we can study Israeli politics. Making that clear at the outset is that I don't have any arguments about what might have been, what could have been, what should have been, and we concentrate on learning what is about Israel. Now, the way we put the book together is the following. I firmly believe that in order to understand contemporary Israeli politics, one has to know a lot about politics before 1948, before Israel ever existed, because the Israeli political system, as we observe it today, carries forward political practices and customs and values that were established long before the state was established. And therefore, unlike some of the other books that are out there, we start really at the beginning of the Zionist period, back in the 1880s, even before Theodor Herzl. So we have an entire section of the book dealing with the history, the political history from the 1880s up till 1948, with a great deal of stress on the continuities between the political system of the Jews in Palestine in the pre-state period, the continuity between that and the politics in Israel after 1948. So that students get this kind of historical perspective. Even though we're not historians, we felt this was an essential ingredient in the book. And a consequence of that is that the reader is going to learn something about the Arab-Israel conflict, because the origins of the Arab-Israel conflict are precisely in this period before 1948 and 1948 itself. And so, incidentally, we do deal with some of these issues, but that really is incidental to understanding the emergence of a Jewish political system during the Mandate period, 1922 to 48. There was a very active and well-functioning Jewish political system in Palestine during the Mandate period, and one of the reasons that Israel in political terms made a smooth transition to being a state in 1948 was because the state already existed in a sense, and it was just a matter of changing names and titles. And I'm not trying to minimize the challenges that they faced in 1948, but running a government was not the big challenge. The big challenge, of course, was the military. But there are some challenges in teaching about Israeli politics that I'd like to mention, because I find every year that I teach the course, these issues come up. One of them has to do with the idea that Israel is based on the idea of the Jewish people rather than the Jewish religion. In North America, when we talk about Jews, Jewish, most people see those terms as applying to a religion. And so students here tend to try to transpose that to Israel, and they say, well, Israel is about the Jewish religion. Israel, of course, is a Jewish state, but it's not a state about the Jewish religion. And it's a very hard concept to convey, because it means that you have to emphasize the idea of Jews as a people. And it was Jews as a people, not Jews as a religion, that established the state of Israel. And in fact, a large number of people who were religiously Jewish rejected the state precisely because it wasn't created as a religious state. So this is a point that we emphasize in the book, which I think is critical for understanding what Israel is all about. Jewish peoplehood, not Jewish religion. The second point however, does have to do with religion, which many students and readers of the book find somewhat confusing, and we hope that we clarify it. Particularly, there are aspects of Israeli politics that do have to do with religion. And specifically in modern times, the convictions of the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox sector of the state. During the early years of Zionism and for some time thereafter, the Haredim were anti-Zionist, not just not sure about it, they were definitively anti-Zionist, based on their understanding and interpretation of Judaism, the Jewish religion. Since 1948, however, they have become non-Zionists for the most part. I don't believe in Zionism, but I'm not against it, and besides, if you let me participate in politics and government, we'll vote, and of course we'll ask for some benefits in exchange. So there's an agreement there as to how non-Zionists can participate in a Zionist political system. Those who have remained anti-Zionist have become irrelevant politically. But it's important to distinguish between the ultra-Orthodox non-Zionists who have their own political parties in Israel and the religious Zionists who are very strongly nationalistic. They're also religious, but their religious ideology is very much opposed to the ideology of the ultra-Orthodox. This is a very difficult point for readers to comprehend because it requires some understanding of the politics of Jewish religious groups in Israel. But we do put some effort in the book in trying to explain this because it has a lot to do with contemporary politics. And you see this played out on a daily basis in the current Israeli government. So this is a very significant issue. So experience has shown us that these points have to be really emphasized at the beginning in order to avoid confusion later on. And so explaining these issues cogently and clearly in the book was one of the major challenges that we had to meet. Another important challenge was how to present the involvement of the Arab community in Israeli politics. Generally, politics is dominated by Israeli Jews, but Israeli Arabs are about 20%, between 20 and 25% of the population, and they vote, they send representatives to the Knesset, so they are, players in politics. Often they are simply overlooked, and there are reasons, good reasons why they are overlooked. They have chosen to stay out of many political activities because they are anti-Zionist. Although some people might dispute that characterization, but I regard them as anti-Zionist, and so they don't fit into a Zionist political system, even though they hold seats in the Knesset and they're freely elected. In any event, we decided to devote quite an extensive chapter to the subject, stressing that there are Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis, and that both groups participate in politics. Obviously, the Jews are more consequential politically, but we do try to treat both sectors of the society fairly. And if one looks ahead, which political scientists probably should not do too often, but if one looks ahead, my guess is that the Arab Israelis will become increasingly important in Israeli politics, especially when and if there is an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. Until that time, I can't see that happening. Toward the end of the book, we try to sum things up. We try to generalize a bit about Israeli politics. And maybe in the question period, we can go into that in greater detail. But I identified, I think, 10 areas which I think represent major changes over the almost 68 years, I guess it is, since the state was established. So we try to give the reader some sense of perspective of a changing political system. It's not static, it's really a dynamic system, and it has a lot of very interesting features which have relevance not just for Israel, but more broadly as well. And finally, to conclude, there is one thing that I think stands out after examining Israeli politics so closely, and that's this. Here is a new country formally established in 1948, populated mostly by people who originated in countries that had few democratic traditions, whether we're talking about Russia or we're talking about Morocco or Yemen. Most of the immigrants who came to Israel, and the immigrants overwhelmed the Israelis who were there in May 1948 in terms of numbers, most of them came from countries that were not democratic at all. Yet Israel was able to build a vibrant democratic political culture that has survived the exceptional stress which no other country has had to face during this period of being in a state of war or readiness for war from its inception. And we know from historical experience that countries that are involved in war often have, for lengthy periods, often have difficulty in maintaining commitments to democratic practices. So to me, this is perhaps Israel's greatest achievement politically, that it has maintained fidelity to a political system that the most Israelis didn't understand well when they became Israelis, and yet they have been socialized into a democratic political culture, which I think has been eminently successful. So, you know, if I had to summarize Israeli politics over 68 years, I would say that probably that's the greatest accomplishment of the state among many other accomplishments. Thank you.
So let me pick up where Hal left off, but first let me echo Hal and thank Chaba and Jennifer for bringing us here and for all the things that they've done to make sure that we get here on time, that we're fed, and so on. And let me also take this public opportunity to thank Hal for having the confidence in me to work with me. As a former student, former students don't always have that opportunity to produce something like this, so I'm actually quite grateful to Hal, and I thank him quite a bit, and I want to take this public opportunity to do so. So let me pick up where Hal left off and talk about the Israeli political system and what that means for us or others who want to teach it to, I'll say, English-speaking audiences. And by that I primarily mean students in places like Canada, the United States, Australia, Britain, and maybe a few others. Places that we often call civic democracies. These are places that are, not always, but often they are immigrant societies where nationalism is centered around a loyalty to a set of institutions rather than based in kin, ethnicity, blood, and so on. Because I think the challenges are greater for teaching a course on Israeli politics to that kind of student audience. So let me just say a few words about a couple things about Israeli politics that makes it difficult, and then I'll talk about why that becomes difficult and why that has become difficult for us. And so I teach in America, but I think that the same general concerns or issues matter for people who teach, or for Hal who teaches Israeli politics in Canada, or for those who teach in Britain or Australia, and maybe a couple other places. And that, first of all, is how do you understand democracy? So especially in America, students think of democracy as a liberal democracy. And a liberal democracy primarily means, or primarily focuses on individual rights and freedoms. It's not really about collective rights, but it's about how individuals have a certain set of liberties, freedoms, rights, and how that fits into the democratic process and how that matters for their belonging, for their sense of belonging, not just citizenship, but their sense of belonging in that particular polity. Israel is not a liberal democracy, and it never was. Before the 1980s, Israel was, okay, so well, to go back even further, as Hal mentioned, all of the Zionist leaders came from places, certainly those who came in the end of Ottoman Palestine and into Mandatory Palestine. Those who came from places that were heavily collectivist. They came out of a milieu in which they had already subscribed to a socialist ethos. and where the ethnic nationalism that dominated these places, particularly in Eastern Europe, were all about kinship and blood and about belonging to an ethno-national community. And that's what the Zionist leaders who came to Israel, that's what they knew, that's what they believed in, and that's what they implemented. And we're talking about the Ashkenazi Jews who came from Eastern Europe and who set up the state institutions and set up the political norms. That's what they believed in, and of course, because labor Zionism dominated that founding process, they also wanted to make sure that the socialist ethos was also part of that process of formation. And the socialist ethos fits very nicely into that collectivist ethos. It's all about sacrifice of the individual for the collective good. And that is the dominant political norm, or the political culture, that prevails in Israel from 1948 to the 1980s. And into the 1980s, as the country moves from a socialist economy to a free market capitalist economy, that collectivism, or that sense of putting the self into a larger collective, that starts to diminish. And you start to see the rise of individualism, consumerism, and so on, as this free market economy, free market capitalism starts to take place and starts to become more prominent. And today, Israel is not a socialist country anymore. But even in the 1980s, and particularly the 1990s and the 2000s, that individual democracy that sense of liberal democracy that we understand it in America, and that is reflected a little bit more, it's reflected in Britain, places like Britain, Canada, and Australia, that liberal democracy doesn't really take hold in Israel. It's still heavily collectivist. You could even use the word tribal now. The Arab public is very much oriented, Arab politics in Israel is very much oriented toward the Arab public, and Jewish Zionist politics are very much oriented toward the Jewish public. And so that idea of a sense of individual rights and a sense of individual belonging in an individual democracy doesn't really take hold even when the country moves to a free market economy. And what's most interesting is that many people today they associate democracy and liberal democracy with the left in Israel, which of course means labor, or today the Zionist Union in the Israeli political arena. But it was never the left that really espoused the liberal democratic idea. It was, of course, the ancestors of Likud, Jabotinsky and others, who were liberals in the classic European sense, when they really did believe in individual rights. Of course, as Jabotinsky passes from the scene, and as Menachem Begin comes to the fore, and then you have a younger generation coming to power in the 90s and into the 2000s, that commitment to an individual democracy also diminishes in favor of a much more nationalist, Jewish nationalist kind of democracy. The second problem that matters for people from students from English-speaking countries is trying to explain what it means to be Jewish and democratic. And so Hal mentioned the idea that Jewish is more complex because it has two meanings. There's the religious meaning and there's the ethno-national meaning, and the two sometimes go together and sometimes they don't. But explaining that to an audience where most of the students have grown up in a democracy that you give your loyalty not to a specific ethnicity, but to a set of institutions or ideas, sets of citizenship, that's a little bit difficult. And so that's why the book, as Hal mentioned, has to go back in time and begin with this historical, sociological development of how the Zionist leaders emerge and how they plan this new state. And so what it means to be a Jewish state is very difficult to explain, not least because Israelis themselves don't have a shared sense of what that means. They disagree over what it means to be Jewish. And there are a number of factors that we have to talk about when we explain this, and we cover all of this in the book in various chapters. Of course, the Declaration of Independence refers to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, capital L, which means that there's that biblical and historical Jewish connection to the land. But the Declaration also, without mentioning the word democracy, it also refers to a whole bunch of things that we associate with democracy. Freedom of religion, lack of discrimination on the basis of religion, race, and sex. It talks about guarantees of equality, of social and political rights. It talks about civil rights. And it calls on Arab citizens to participate fully and equally in the political system. Of course, it also refers to the Jewish people, and it also has an implicit reference to God, and God is a religious concept when it refers to the Rock of Israel. There was a big debate over whether or not God should be mentioned in the Declaration. The compromise was that the Declaration would refer to the Rock of Israel, the Rock being a metaphor, in a sense, for God. Also, Israel's borders are, in certain areas, Israel's borders are not well defined. So Israel's borders are not, most of them are not the result of peace treaties. They are now, but from 1948 to 1979, they were not the result of peace treaties. They were only the result of armistice agreements at the end of the war. Today, one Israeli border is very blurry. And that, of course, is the border with the West Bank or the Green Line, where Israeli citizens have moved across the Green Line from Israel proper into the West Bank, and Israeli law has often followed. And then, of course, we just had in the last little while, the Israeli Knesset has passed 2 laws, both of which raise questions about what role Israeli sovereignty and what role Israeli law should have in an area that Israel has not annexed and that is not made legally part of Israel. And that, of course, was a law allowing for Israeli citizens to expropriate private Palestinian land in the West Bank, and then just recently a law that allows Israel to ban foreign nationals who advocate for a boycott of Israel, but also for a boycott of settlement products. And so again, that's of a place that's not in sovereign Israel, but in a place that's disputed, and that Israel has not actively claimed or legally annexed to make part of it. At the same time, Israel is simply a Jewish state at its most basic level, because 75 to 80% of the population is Jewish. The positions of decision-making authority are controlled by Jews. The state's symbols, the flag, the coat of arms, the anthem, they all reflect Jewish religious and cultural history. They all reflect Jewish ideas, Jewish priorities. And so to talk about Israel as a Jewish state makes sense from that kind of perspective. What complicates it, of course, is that the state does not rely on a specific definition of Jewish. The state has paid employees, these are state employees, who work on behalf of religion. So Israel has, the major religious communities in Israel have autonomy to govern their own personal affairs according to their own religion. So the Islamic community, the Jewish community, the Christian community, or at least the major denominations in them, they get to govern their own affairs according to their own religious laws. So even though in Israel, Judaism does not govern the state's laws, there are paid employees of the state, rabbis and others, who do implement Orthodox Jewish law for Israeli citizens. So the definition of religion, Jewishness according to Judaism, is not officially part of the state, but those who do propose or those who do promote an Orthodox understanding of Jewish are paid employees of the state. At the same time, Israel has a law of return. And that law of return allows for any Jew to come to live in Israel and to become a citizen of Israel. And the law of return is not a religious definition. The law of return specifically says that a person can come to Israel and receive the exact same rights and citizenships as a Jew if they are, quote, a child and a grandchild of a Jew, the spouse of a Jew, the spouse of a child of a Jew, and the spouse of a grandchild of a Jew. So it's an expansive understanding of who gets to claim citizenship in Israel. And then finally, of course, you have a Supreme Court that has elevated a number of Israeli laws to constitutional status. So I might be repetitive here, but Israel does not have a written constitution for the same reasons that it was very difficult to implement any kind of new political system in 1948. There was a lot of other stuff going on. People disagreed over what a constitution would look like. Orthodox Jews said there already was a constitution in the Torah. And so what Israel decided to do was establish a series of basic laws, capital B, capital L, that would eventually form separate chapters to a constitution once it was eventually written. What the Supreme Court did in the 1990s was make the basic laws constitutional, give them constitutional status, which meant that they had a higher priority over regular legislation. So any basic law that gets created is more meaningful in terms of setting out the character of the Israeli state and mattering for Israeli politics and for Israeli law. What it also did at that same time, or rather by doing so, what it did was it made constitutional 2 basic laws in particular that refer to the values of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So now, Jewish and democratic is now a constitutional status in Israel, or it has constitutional status. So any law that might come before the Supreme Court, in theory anyways, has to meet the standard of Jewish and democratic. But neither of those terms are defined. And as I've already explained, there are a whole bunch of other factors that make it harder to understand what Jewish and what democratic means in practice. So the question is, how do you explain all this to students who don't understand what Jewish is and can't be expected to, since Israelis themselves have different meanings, different understandings, and have a different understanding of what democracy is. So one prominent Israeli scholar, Sami Smuha, has written about Israel, calling it an ethnic democracy. What that means is that one ethnic group or one ethno-national group is privileged over other ethnic groups in the state, yet the state is still democratic. And Smuha doesn't say that this is a bad thing. He doesn't compare Israel to Western states, like Canada, the United States, Britain, and so on. He compares Israel to European states, where ethnicity and nationalism and a sense of peoplehood based on kinship and blood is the defining feature in most European states, particularly in Eastern European states. And so for Smuha, that's a legitimate way to be. That's a legitimate system to have. But American students and Canadian students and others have a harder time grasping that. And so the question is, how do you teach them about all of this when all of this stuff is multifaceted and Israelis themselves are always disagreeing over what it means to be Jewish? Should it be a secular definition? Should it be a religious definition? How should Jewish be incorporated into the state? How do you balance a Jewish and a non-Jewish population? What do you do with Israeli law or for Israeli citizens who live within these specific borders versus those who live in an area that Israel has not claimed for itself, has not legally made part of Israel, the West Bank? How do you make sure that Jewish and democratic get balanced? What does it mean to be democratic? Does it mean individual rights? Does it mean collective rights for different ethno-national communities and so on? And so that's why in the book, what we try to do is cover a whole range of issues by explaining it from this historical perspective. Because the Israeli political system, as it exists today, emerges over a process of many decades that to some extent was purposeful, but to some extent was accidental in the sense that the Zionist leaders took much of what was already in existence and said, okay, you know what, it's worked so far, let's try using it now, and maybe later on we'll have time to fix this stuff. Which of course, once you start on the path of something, it's very hard to change, and these things become embedded and it becomes even harder to try and change things, which is what exactly happened in the Israeli political system. So the question is, how do we teach this to students who don't think of Israeli democracy and Israeli Jewishness in these same terms? And I think we do a good job in the book of setting out one way to do that, or at least the way that we thought was most appropriate, which is to cover a whole bunch of topics, as I said, from this historical perspective, but to explain that these things are contested over, that Israelis don't agree over them, and that they continue to struggle in the political arena over these very questions. And that's why we talk about multiple political parties. That's why we talk about Arab politics. That's why we talk about Jewish politics. We talk about the changing nature of the system. We talk a little bit about the conflict. We need all of this stuff in order to be able to understand Israeli politics. And perhaps that's why the book is so thick and the writing is so small, so we can squish all of that stuff in there. But we think it's important. And so that's what we tried to do in the book, and I think that we were successful in doing so. The question, of course, is one thing that we try not to do. We certainly do draw conclusions in the book, but when you're talking about this stuff to students, you don't want to tell them what to think. You just want to be able to show them that there are all these kinds of questions, and that they should be able to try and approach these questions on their own. But we want them to have the tools to be able to think about them in an informed manner. And so, if you ever get the chance to read the book, hopefully you'll reach the same conclusion that we did. But certainly that was our intention. And we recognize that it can be difficult to teach certain audiences, English-speaking audiences from these civic democracies, all of this kind of stuff. And that's not a problem, because as I said, Israelis themselves don't agree on these things, and they struggle over these very questions. So with that, I'll end even a couple minutes earlier so we have more time for questions.
To stay here right next to the two speakers, and I would like to thank both of them for keeping so diligently imposed time frame. To get a conversation started, I'm going to do something that I never did before, and that is to abuse my role as a moderator to actually put the first question on the table. Arguably, whenever you write an article, whenever you write a book, whenever you make a statement, whenever you take a class, we always make a choice. We always make choices about things that we don't put down, things that we don't talk about, things that we decide to leave out. Sometimes we blame it on time, sometimes it's conscious. Can you tell us whether there were any arguments between the two of you about things that ended up not being part of the book and not part of the course that I teach? Or this is a beautiful consensus that were the result of convergence?
Well, I mean, for one thing, we had strict limits on how much we could write. So, for example, a topic that I think is really unusual to Israeli politics, in which I would like to include, is Israel-diaspora relations, because the diaspora Jews sometimes get involved in Israeli politics, but we didn't have room for it, so that was left out. But probably there are other things as well. One of the reviewers said that he or she appreciated how much history we gave about the pre-state period, but they wanted to see more history of what happened after 1948, which we didn't have room for, another example.
I don't think we disagreed on what to include or what to leave out. We might have had different, disagreed would be too strong a word, but I mean, we read each other's chapters and we read the whole thing multiple times. We probably had some differences of how long various chapters should be, but it was quite consensual. We really didn't disagree over the topics to include, which I think is quite rare for something like this.
Thank you. All right, so the floor is open. Maybe I will take batches of questions. So let me take three. I see three hands. Sam, the gentleman here, and the gentleman in the back. So let me just collect the questions, and then we'll get done.
The two of you pointed out that what is key to understanding the history of Israel is the collectivist mentality as opposed to individual liberal democratic one. But you only hinted at the fact that there is a bunch of collectivist identity. There isn't only one collectivist identity. There are different competing collective identities. There's the secular Western one, the secular Eastern one, there's the religious one. So the question is, Israel has to deal with these multiple group identities who have different visions of what Israel is or should be. And one can even make the argument that the thing that probably kept it going and together and formed and had some common bond was the question of constant war. That had it not been for the constant wars, there probably would have been natural splits, and you would have not had a really united country. You would have had a very deeply divided and fragmented country. So the question is, where do we go from in the future, given this kind of fragmented structure?
Great, thank you.
2 nights ago at the Shar HaShamayim, I saw an Israeli film made a year ago called The Women's Balcony. Very entertaining film, and as the rabbi commented afterwards, it's just about the only Israeli film he has seen. No one is killed, no one dies, and no one says Kaddish. It was just an entertaining film. You have male-female battles, you have the old and the new, there's all kinds. Israel is an amazing country, but they have 200,000 problems and conflicts. And my comment after the film was that if they could settle the problem between the ultra-Orthodox and the modern Orthodox, which is probably the tiniest Israeli problem, slowly all the others would be solved. So I have 2 questions. The first is, exactly how important are the ultra-Orthodox? Because they do have seats in Knesset now, and they make a lot of noise, and they're a bigger and they're a growing group, but they're a problem in one way. And the other one is, having looked at all the situation in Israel with politics and problems, if you had to start by solving one problem, what would be the best place or the easiest place to try to solve Israel's 200,000 problems?
And let's take one more question.
Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate you both on an amazing book. I read it. It's incredibly insightful, a must read, and I'm not an academic. And let me tell you, anyone with an interest in this has to read the book. But here's my question. There are many who do perceive the present Israeli government as being tone deaf to global public opinion, including that of the diaspora. I want to know if you both agree with that, and if so, do you see it as damaging for the country?
We have three very thought-provoking questions.
Sure. On the future of divisions in Israel, yeah, we talk about those divisions a little bit in the book. And there's some really interesting survey data by the Israel Democracy Institute on how Israelis, both Jews and Arabs, but how they perceive their own identity, how they define Israel, what's more important to them, Israeli, Jewish, religious, ethnicity. And what it really shows is that it underlines the fact that you have these divisions. And I think these divisions, so Israel has always had a number of divisions. I think some of them have declined or diminished over time. You see between the Mizrahi and the Ashkenazi communities, you see more intermarriage. You see, there's still considerable marginalization in the Mizrahi community, but you see that's decreasing as a source of tension. What we have seen in other cases, though, is a rise of tension between the Ethiopian community and the Israeli state, certainly between the Arab community and the Jewish community, and certainly between the Orthodox community writ large and the secular community, but also there are increasing divisions within the Orthodox communities. And not just between Zionists and non-Zionists, but within each one as well. And in fact, many of the politics that play out at the national level in the Orthodox community are actually just reflections of what's these internal politics at the local level. I don't think those divisions are going anywhere, but that said, that's not an Israeli thing specifically. That's a normal process when you have an immigrant community or an immigrant country. And Israel is an immigrant country, and it has people who come from specific communities from different places with different experiences, different cultures, and it's natural for them to have different perspectives. The problem that I see, and that I was trying to allude to, is that because Israel has not satisfactorily defined itself, either its democracy or its Jewishness or the character itself of the state, that encourages these divisions to continue. Perhaps I'm being overly pessimistic, but I'm not so sure. Until those basic definitions of what it means to be Israel get resolved, those divisions will remain. And they will get reflected in the political arena. But I think it's also important to note that, as Hal said, Israel has a remarkably low experience with intra-group rioting compared to many other places. A lot of these problems do get resolved. Resolved might be the wrong word, but a lot of them do get negotiated through at the political level. And that's a positive thing. And that's something that I think we can point to as maybe not uniquely Israel, but something that is inherent to Israel that is a positive thing that we should hope continues to maintain.
Would you like to take the second
I'll
question?
respond to Mel. Actually, I don't think that the differences between the religious Zionist Orthodox and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, are small differences at all. I think they are very significant differences, primarily in terms of the attitude towards Zionism. The former group of religious Zionists are very Zionistic, and arguably they, among their numbers, are the most Zionistically motivated people in the country right now. We see it not only socially, but you see it in the army, where religious Zionists are disproportionately represented in the elite units and increasingly in command positions. Whereas the Haredim are against getting involved in the army. They are certainly not embracing Zionism. And in fact, the issue over conscription for the Haredim exacerbated the divide between the religious Zionists and the Haredim. The most intense feelings that I encountered in Israel regarding this issue of drafting the young Haredim was among the religious Zionists. They said, we are sending our children to the army, and these guys are freeloaders. And the intensity of the antagonism was just astonishing. So I think that there are very significant differences between them, and we saw this played out, for example, in the previous government of Prime Minister, 2013 to 2015, when the conscription bill was passed, because the ultra-Orthodox parties were not represented in the government. And the parties that were pushing most strenuously for that bill were, on the one hand, the Bayit Yehudi, which is the religious Zionist party, and on the other hand, the mostly secular Yesh Atid, centrist party. And they joined together to push for this legislation. And of course, when the new government was formed after the 2015 election, it all went away because the Haredim were in the government on the condition that the government not enforce that. So I think those are very strong differences, very substantial.
Brent, would you like to take the third question?
Tone deaf.
The tone deaf question.
Well, there's also the whip problem should be solved first. Okay, I'll do the tone deaf one. No, I want you to do the problem. That the first thing to say about Netanyahu is that everybody thinks that they know what he thinks, including me. But what that tells us is that nobody really knows. So, my personal opinion, I don't think Netanyahu is tone deaf. I think he is fully aware of things that are going on at the international community and international public opinion, but I think he feels very much constrained because of his coalition. He wants to be in power. He does not want to be out of power. Ideally for him, status quo would be the best thing. Status quo in every way. He's not a visionary, he's not a dramatic person, he's a manager. Because anything else disrupts his place in power, disrupts what he thinks is the best for Israel. I think he feels beholden to coalition partners in all of his governments. And I think that pushes him sometimes to seem tone deaf and to do things that people in the international community, including diaspora Jews, like this recent law passed regarding banning people who call for boycotts, including things that upset diaspora Jews. And so I think that's a problem. I think other members of his government, particularly those on the right and the far right, I think it's not that they're tone deaf, it's that they just don't care. They have their own agenda, and they very much want to push that particular agenda.
Okay, I have the next batch of 3 questions. Janice, Professor Amor, Professor Freiburg? No? And Ben and
Mina?
Mina?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Janice, Professor Amor, Ben, and Mina. For now. Yes, Janice.
Okay, do you explain in the book why they chose a parliamentary system at the beginning of statehood instead of, let's say, becoming a republic?
We do.
Yeah.
Over a couple.
Okay, I'm just curious to know. Also, why were they so wedded to democracy, given that, as you say, the leaders did not come from a democratic tradition and so on? And it probably would be easy, given to have a more authoritarian type of government, given the circumstances there.
Okay, Professor Amor.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation of Israel major issues, but I do think that your approach to these issues is quite conservative and mainstream. And I would like to challenge your mainstream approach. And I would say that one of the things that is missing, and I would follow Baba, is the disengagement in your perception of a very fundamental aspect of Israeli culture, of politics and society, which is a society in suspense. Israel does not make decisions. And I would go a little bit further in this line. I would argue that Israel as a nation state is neither a nation nor a state. To a large extent, in order to have an Israeli nation, the Jewish people resented. In order to have a state, many of the Jews resent the notion of citizenship. Because if you would have a state, you would have to declare who are the citizens, where are the borders, what kind of relationship between the government. So the question that I have for you is, what are the forces in your mind that keep this conservative to some extent, reactionary approach to the historical changes that are going on. That there is a guy like Benjamin Netanyahu who wants to manage an anarchic system by applying a very conservative approach to the general questions which are actually fundamental to the well-being of most people in that very small territory.
Thanks very much. Ben and Mina.
Yes, I just want to preface by saying that I come from a family, Eastern European socialists. They're very, very left-wing. And I came to political consciousness in the 60s and 70s. And so I always favored the socialist path that Israel had taken. Over a period of time, I read more about Menachem Begin, and the best quote that I heard him when asked, what was your greatest achievement, he said, twice I avoided civil war, which to me was just a marvelous and humble response to the question. Where would you put Menachem Begin, his importance in the Israeli political scene?
Thank you. And Mina?
My question would be, I know that Dr. Sasley mentioned the different meanings of what it means to be Jewish. There's the ethno-national meaning, the secular and the religious meaning. Maybe like more specifically, how would you define those three meanings?
Thank you very much. So let's take these 4 questions for now. Gentlemen?
I'll tackle Janice's question. I don't think there was any question that they were going to have a parliamentary system, even though they all came, the people who set this up, it was set up during the mandate period. These were people who came largely from Russia and Poland. And yet they understood that the kind of country that they wanted to have was going to be a democratic system and was going to be based on parliament. I mean, the parliamentary model was the most common model in Europe, with which they were familiar. They never considered the presidential model, such as the U.S. has, which is the main alternative to a parliamentary system among democratic states. So I don't think there was any serious debate about it. And during the mandate period, they set up a very elaborate system of elections and institutions which were at base democratic. They had all kinds of elections because they were emulating the experience in the Zionist Congresses going back to the time of Theodor Herzl, which had delegates from all over the place, and they voted democratically to make policy. And so when in the Yishuv during the 1920s and 30s they wanted to establish institutions, there was no question about having some kind of voting system. And in fact, it's interesting to look at the data. The data are available of how Jews in the Yishuv voted in these various elections. And what was clear, interestingly, was that generally they voted predominantly for the Labor Party, or Mapai as it was styled after 1930, while in Zionist elections outside of Palestine, the non-socialist parties did much better. And that reflected the characteristics of the immigrants to Palestine during the early Aliyot. So I don't think there was any serious question.
So there was no real debate about it at the time?
No, I mean, there were accusations that Ben-Gurion and his colleagues often acted in a Bolshevik manner, but these were not, somebody here certainly understands the reference, but these were not serious accusations that they were going to follow the path of Lenin.
Okay, question raised by Professor Amor on the conservative approach.
So the first thing I would say is my concern isn't that Israel doesn't make decisions, it's that it is reactive instead of proactive. And not in everything, but certainly relating to regarding the peace process, relations with the Palestinians, regarding the West Bank. Because Israel has made decisions on certain key moments. I'm not totally clear what you mean by a conservative approach. And I'll use this example because it addresses a question you raised, and you can tell me if I'm off base. But so, for example, the political right has been dominant in Israel since 2009, and as far as I can tell, will be for the near future. And the reason it is because voters keep voting for center-right and right-wing parties. And there are specific things that we talk about in the book, specific motivating factors that drive that. And there's nothing to suggest that the left will, or the center-left, will become stronger anytime soon, barring any kind of unforeseen major circumstance, such as Netanyahu falling from grace, and the right falling apart over who gets to lead the right-wing camp. But I think we can explain that by reference to motivating factors, and many of these, by the way, are the same factors that motivate voters in any country. Gender to some extent, age, ethnicity, religion, place of residence, socioeconomic status. So I don't know if I'm directly answering your question.
I'll give you a hint to what I mean by conservative. Israel is the only state in the world that has no border, no declared border. And most of the hegemonic forces in Israel are actually fine with that. And that's actually what we still have. We have a state without borders, and this is the ongoing politics of Israel for the last 70 years.
Well, I'd like to comment on that because, respectfully, I disagree. I believe that you said that Israel does know who its citizens are and where are the borders. The citizenship is defined in Israel, and everybody knows who's a citizen and who's not, and the people who carry citizenship papers are citizens.
I don't agree. In the case of Uzi Orman, the Supreme Court of Israel said to Uzi Orman that they don't recognize Israeliness or Israelis as citizens of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel does not recognize Israeliness as citizens or as the description of Israeli citizens. It's not me, it's the Israeli Supreme Court. We have a definition of citizens on the basis of Jewishness or non-Jewishness, but not Israeli. Israelis are not recognized in Israel. It's the only country in the world that does not recognize Israeli.
Do you want to clarify, because it may not be evidently clear to everyone in the room what it means being an Israeli?
I don't want to.
Because you're not meaning Israeli Arabs.
In 2013, there was a case in the Supreme Court discussed by an Israeli guy, a professor, a philologist, who argued that he wants that in his identity card would be written that he is an Israeli. And the Supreme Court decided against his request. And they said, Israel does not recognize Israelis, but it recognizes Jews, and that's
Right.
what the existing laws do.
Okay, but he's unquestionably an Israeli citizen because he's carrying an identity card. So his citizenship is established. He is
Formally, you're right.
He is an Israeli, but traditionally on the Teudat Zehut, the identity card, they have listed nationality, which is not the same as citizenship. Nationality has been Jewish or Arab. They used to list religion as well, but if you have an identity card, it says you're an Israeli citizen, and you can get a passport which says you are an Israeli citizen. And so I think that there is.
That's why I called your approach a very mainstream, and to a large extent, conservative.
Okay, and as far as the borders go, I would contend that Israel does have borders. It has borders with Egypt that are based on a peace treaty. It has borders with Jordan based on a peace treaty. It has de facto borders with Lebanon, not based on a peace treaty, but based on the armistice agreements, and no one is really contesting those borders. The main border that's undetermined is between Israel and the territories, and what will be on the other side of that line eventually. And is that because Israel doesn't want to have borders? It's because of circumstances which have prevented a final determination of what that border would be. But the position of the government is we are prepared to negotiate a settlement involving that territory, and one aspect of that settlement is to define the border there. So I think that the absence of complete accepted borders is not because Israel doesn't want to have borders, but because it has not been able to make peace with Palestinians yet. And I don't want to get into, in this discussion, as to why there isn't.
You would like chapter 18 in the book, because we do talk about that, and we specifically mentioned that.
I'm going to that.
So chapter
Thank
18,
you
read
very
that.
much.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, 2 questions that still need an answer, and then we are going to have to close it. I see that there are still a couple of members in the audience who want to ask questions. I'm going to ask you to maybe follow up with our speakers privately after we conclude, but formally we have to conclude by 7 o'clock. So let me ask Professors Waller and Sasley to respond to Ben's question about Menachem Begin and Mina's question about
I apologize for the narrowness.
No, I think that Begin is one of the most interesting figures in Israeli politics. The point I'd like to make first is that among North American Jews, I find that there is a great deal of discomfort whenever Likud is in power. And this was evident when Begin was in power, certainly when Shamir was prime minister, and now with Netanyahu. Having said that, I think that Begin deserves a lot of credit in terms of the development of the political system. First of all, he demonstrated that you could have an alternative to the labor Zionists. Secondly, he had the vision to make the breakthrough with Egypt, first peace treaty. He initiated the transformation of the economy, even though that was not his main concern. They certainly made a lot of mistakes during the Begin years in terms of the economy, which led to the terrible hyperinflation in the early 1980s. But the fact of the matter is that his government was the first one that was prepared to depart from the prevailing economic view of the Labor Party, which was not beneficial for the economy. Much of the growth and dynamism of the economy has come from the post-Begin period, largely, I think, through the examples that he set. I think, by the way, Netanyahu gets a lot of credit as well for the development of the economy. His role as finance minister in the early 2000s was very significant. I think Begin also, one last point, conveyed a sense of Jewishness and connection to Jewish history in a way that most of his predecessors did not. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that.
So on being Jewish, there are 3 broad sort of ways to think about it. Being Jewish is a peoplehood, a nationhood. And there's evidence for this. I mean, first of all, it's a sense of belonging. There's also some genetic evidence that ties together most Jewish communities. I think, with the exception of Jewish communities in India, Georgia, and one other country, but the genetic evidence suggests that there are all these close ties. There, of course, is the religious definition, that you practice Judaism, and there's a definition that emerges very clearly in the Pew Research survey of American Jews. When asked to define what it means to be Jewish, large percentages talk about things like Jewish humor, Jewish food, living a good life, not a good life, living a meaningful life, social justice, and that's a lot more sort of vague and cultural almost, and so you could even make the argument that's a secular definition. The other thing that complicates it is that there's a difference from all of that for Israeli Jews and for American or diaspora Jews. So, best example is for diaspora Jews on Yom Kippur, the holiest day according to the Jewish calendar. Most diaspora Jews will go to synagogue. Sometimes they go only on that day. But going to synagogue is an important date, is important for them. Most Israeli Jews, the non-Orthodox, don't go to synagogue, but they'll go have a picnic in the park with their families. So for them, being Jewish in that sense is about living in Israel, right? What we call Hebrew culture or Israeli culture. That's a different understanding of what it means to be Jewish from diaspora Jews. So you have those 3 different perspectives, and then you can divide it according to diaspora and Israel. It's a short answer, but I don't know if it addresses the question.
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a final round of applause. Thank you. different items of business to share with you. The first one has to do with the books. Now that you've been teased to the book, should you care to want to read them, and I hope you will, where to get them. So the Concordia bookstore as well as Concordia's co-op bookstore both carry copies of the book. Should you have any difficulties, please call the Institute office at 514-848-2424, extension 8721. It's also on our website, and we'll be very happy to help you obtain copies of the book. So they are definitely easily accessible and easily available.
Sorry, the name again is?
Politics in Israel, Governing a Complex Society. And I would also like to invite you to please join us at our upcoming event on March 22nd, just one floor down from here. This will be a research seminar.
In this room.
Sorry,
In this
room.
Yes.
In this room. On March 22nd, it's a Wednesday, noontime discussion on Tel Aviv, urban autonomy put to the test during the transition from the British Mandate to Israeli statehood. And this will be a seminar given by Dr. Eran Eldar, who is here with us from the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv, who is spending a year at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Again, on behalf of the Institute, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. Please sign the sheet if you haven't done so already. Have a lovely evening.